Hello, friends. This is Rob Blum. Many of you know me. Actually, I'm sending this out to my friends, although I'm telling you, you can share this with other friends if you wish. Um, I'm uh, I'm an American. I spend about half my time in Tel Aviv in Israel, half the time in suburban New York. Also, as most of you know, I'm chairman of Honest Reporting, which is a media bias watchdog based in Jerusalem. We've been around for about 22 years. Um, watching the media and trying to prevent the media from bias and misleading stories with respect to Israel. I'm here speaking totally in a personal capacity, nothing to do with Honest Reporting, but my Honest Reporting involvement gives me access to some information before it comes public, and I'm a news junkie, and so it all fits. Anyway, so many of you have reached out to me over the last 24 hours, texting me, seeing if I'm okay. Thankfully, I was supposed to fly to Israel this morning. I'm still in the U.S. Hopefully, a reservist got my seat. It was determined by my boss at Honest Reporting, who works for me, but she's my boss, that I'm better off here than there. Um, it. Some of you have been asking what's going on there. I don't understand it. This is just unfathomable. The incredible failure by the Israeli government, the Israeli intelligence community, and just the the breadth of the savagery and what has happened here. So I figured I'd do, hopefully I'll keep this to not too long, a short video kind of hitting the highlights, answering a lot of the questions you guys have been asking separately. So I'll put it in one place, about Israel's horrific 9/11 event. But put in context, this is like 9/11 if over 100,000 Americans have been killed in 9/11, not 3,000. Of course, 600 plus Israelis slaughtered, primarily civilians slaughtered in the Gaza attack yesterday. Was, you got to view that Israel is a much smaller country than America. Basically, this war was a wake-up call to Israel that the status quo they've been pursuing very successfully for the last 20 years, no war and no peace, kind of disengagement, kind of not, that it has stopped working. You know, there's really, in short strokes, the Israeli public for a while, every couple of years, Hamas shoots rockets at Israel. Iron Dome has given us enormous strategic depth to kind of, I don't say ignore the rockets, but not to go in on the ground to dismantle the whole rocket network. It's given Israel strategic depth to, bomb targets, send a message to Hamas, and reestablish deterrence for a couple of years. That's over. It's funny. In Israel, there's been a sense, and the polls show it over the years, that with each one of these things, kind of the common sense feeling by people on the ground, particularly people who live closer to Gaza and are more subjected to the risk of rocket attacks and terrorism, terror tunnels, is that we used to say on Wall Street, your first loss is your best loss. The longer you let a problem fester, the worse it gets, and the more expensive it gets to get out of it. And so there have been polls rising over the course of time in Israel to really go in and clean out Hamas once and for all. Netanyahu's government, and he's really been the guy in power for the last decade, more or less, has been to kind of manage this as if it's, I don't know, a social disease or something, but keep it to a low boil. And as a result, Israel has benefited with enormous prosperity. As fewer dead from terrorist incident than probably at any decade in Israel's history. So it kind of worked, but there was a growing sense in Israel that someday this would bite us in the ass. And now that's happened. And where do we go from here? Let's start with talking a little bit about Gaza. Israel evacuated Gaza in totality in 2005 under Ariel Sharon. Some lunatics expected it to turn into the Riviera of the Mediterranean or of the Southern Mediterranean, but that didn't happen. In 2006, the Gazans had a democratic election where democratically they elected Hamas as their leaders. Now, let's talk about Hamas a little bit. So that's who the people chose, okay? They might not like it now, and there's a sense on the ground that they're really unhappy with what Hamas has meant for them. But, that's who they chose. And elections have consequences, unfortunately, for both the Israelis and for Gaza. Hamas is a theocratic group. It's an outshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. It's 70% funded by Iran, and the rest is from Qatar, Relief Organization for Palestinians, and other humanitarian aid. You have to understand the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic political party. Hamas is an Islamic political party, like Erdogan's party in Turkey, Islamic political party. What do they all have in common, other than coming from the founders of Islamic terrorism? They all believe in a global caliphate. They all believe that land once occupied and controlled by Muslims always is to be occupied and controlled by Muslims. And therefore, it's a tremendous affront that the Jewish people occupy and control Israel, even though it goes back to the Bible, 1,400 years before Islam was created, that Israel was Jewish land, and put that aside, okay? I think it's been shown in the last day to many people, surprisingly. I don't know why they should be surprised, given the ideology of Hamas, but I think people have kind of started to understand that Hamas is really like ISIS, okay? They have a lot in common. Their views towards the global caliphate are the same. Their baseline anti-Semitism is the same. Their tactics of savagery, medieval savagery, are identical. Okay, in ISIS, we all were shocked by the imagery from ISIS, and we decided we needed to, even though Barack Obama called ISIS the JV of terrorist groups, they certainly shocked, and we went back into Iraq, and we're in Syria, and we've done everything we could to eradicate it. The same has to happen with Hamas. Israel realizes it. Hopefully the rest of the world realizes it now. After seeing the horrific imagery of women being raped and dragged through streets in Gaza, and their children, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, being taken as hostages, separated from families, taken to Gaza as hostages. These people are just severe animals, and that's their offshoot of their religion, and we have to accept that and deal with that. And ultimately, the problem here is that innocent Gazans who elected Hamas are going to suffer, because one of Hamas's tactics is to hide behind civilians all the time, shooting rockets from mosques, apartment buildings, schools, hotels, you name it, using their own people as human shields, and then using those people for PR purposes when they're killed in battle, because Israel can't just sit there and allow rockets to be shot at them. They must stop that. Part of what, you kind of look at some of the broadcasts that that was shown, we're getting a lot of footage on on Instagram and other social services that come from Hamas, showing the brutality, showing their slaughter of people in the streets. They're, knocking down doors in safe rooms in people's houses to torture and kill parents in front of children. They're showing these videos gleefully. Okay, they're gleeful in the videos. We've seen videos of people celebrating in the streets of Gaza City, as well as, by the way, in the streets of the PA-dominated West Bank. And you kind of ask yourself the question: why are they doing this? Why are they're giving us ammunition to show that they're inhuman savages and they need to be defeated. Because the world, it's very hard for the world to deny that, to say that these are deep fake videos. They're coming from Hamas, and they're not, and they're owning it. I don't know. One of you asked me, why do they do that? And it's because their worldview is completely different. They view Israel as colonizers, and they view the broadcasts as ways to cow Israelis to leave Israel, as other colonizers have been forced out. What they don't understand is that, Jews in Israel view themselves as coming from Israel from the days of the Bible, long before there was Islam. And the other aspects is that Jews feel they really have nowhere else to go, whether the majority of Israelis are Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from the Arab countries. They ain't going back there. And the roughly half the country that's European Orient, derived Jews, they become Israelis, and it's part of the ethos of the country. I think I'll try my Hebrew. Ein li eretz acheret. I don't have another country. Okay, and that's something that Hamas just doesn't seem to understand. So, in fact, I can make the argument that if the Muslim Brotherhood, if the Gazans particularly, if they're part of the global Islamic Caliphate, maybe they should be pushed out to Egypt or Jordan or somewhere else. I'm just saying that. I'm not saying that meaningfully. I'm just saying that as a philosophical bent on what they're saying. And by the way, in the 20th century, when wars of aggression have been waged, like the German war on Poland in World War II, at the end of the war, millions of Germans were ejected from Western Poland and moved back to Germany. So, we had the Pakistanis and Indians, Greeks and Turks. That's the history. Population exchanges are the history of the 20th century. And in fact, when the Palestinians, when the Israeli War of Liberation happened in 1948, you had a form of population exchange. You had about 800,000 Jews from Arab countries who were kicked out, had their property stolen, etc., that came to Israel, and about 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were forced out of Israel. They actually weren't forced out. They according to the UN, according to their own sources, the lion's share left voluntarily because they thought the Arab armies that were invading Israel would soon win and they can come back in. Well, they were wrong. Anyway, so the mandate of Hamas is the elimination of Israel, removal of Jews. And these attacks, they use the most savage means possible. They, but that's what they use against their own people. When they kicked the PA, the Palestinian Authority, out of in 2006 out of Gaza, they were throwing PA officials off of buildings. It was savaging their people. You see, they murder gay people. You're dealing with ISIS. Just keep thinking Hamas equals ISIS, and you'll keep it in perspective. Israel, going back to how we got here, Netanyahu has tried to manage the pressure with Hamas over the years. We've had a history of rocket attacks and Israeli reaction. We then compensate with giving 13,000 daily work permits to Gazans to come work in Israel. Hamas gives those to their best friends. They make 5 times as much in Israel as they do in Gaza, so it's a big political Benny. Um, we give them electricity, yada yada yada, and then we allow Qatar to pay them off as well. So which gives them political influence. And so that's kind of the way it's been working when it's working. Little bit about the details. The casualty numbers are still going up. As of right this second, it's 600 dead, primarily civilians. I mean, today, the revelation that we really knew yesterday, um, that 240 were slaughtered at that music festival, at that rave, in the desert, no place to hide, horrible loss of young people. And, the impact that's going to have on Israel politically, you have to go back into history. In the early 2000s, coming off of the peace initiatives of the mid 1900s, we had the Intifada, okay, the second Intifada, and over 1,000 people were killed, and I think 40 suicide bombings, many young people, and that kind of like cemented a generation's approach that the leftist ways of accommodation weren't going to work. We were not going to have peace with these people. They want to kill us. Let's just have disengagement. And out of that came the disengagement where Israel gave up Gaza, handed over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority in 2005. The borders were open initially until terrorism started coming in. And then Israel closed the borders, and Egypt closed the border too to Gaza, by the way, which you'll never read about in the media. But Egypt maintains as tight of a border as Israel does, in some forms even tighter, because they're concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood aspect, political, contamination, and other things. There's a lot of illegal trade. It is what it is. People ask about how this happened, and we won't know until the full investigations are in. To some macro level, probably a level of Israeli hubris, business as usual. You could be sure that there's an intelligence report somewhere where somebody predicted this exactly to happen, just like the Yom Kippur War, where Israel had an agent, and it was all there, and political figures thought they knew better. But we'll see. We don't know. Groupthink, incompetence, and arrogance all play into catastrophic decisions like this. There are also some bad coincidences. It was an Israeli holiday. It was a Jewish holiday. It was Shabbat. Typically on holidays and Shabbat, Israeli military, the kids in the army are sent home for the weekend. It's kind of like, sleepaway camp with a weekend. It's very cute when you see on Thursday afternoon, because the weekend starts on Friday. Thursday afternoon, you'll see these teenagers all around the country with these giant backpacks with their laundry, bringing it home for their mothers to wash for the next week. And so you had, bases on the border were empty to start with, or not empty, but close to empty. On top of that, you had 2 large units that were moved from Gaza to the West Bank because of fears of violence. The level of terrorist violence on the West Bank has been steadily increasing the last really couple of months, but particularly in the last couple of days. And so the thought was, let's move people there. That even exposed even more hollowness to the monitoring of Gaza, where, again, arrogance and hubris maybe played a little bit part of their confidence in being able to predict how Hamas would act. And by the way Hamas engaged in this invasion, literally, I saw something on Channel 13 in Israel in Hebrew, a video that showed exactly They laid out, it was a translation of Hamas TV about a month ago, a TV show on Hamas TV, laid out exactly how they were going to do this. They were going to use rockets to, you know, make Israelis think that it was a rocket attack. Then they were going to infiltrate, and then they were going to they had maps to infiltrate a bunch of communities, like 20 communities, doing it on a holiday, and they were going to come in and slaughter and maim and take hostages because that was going to have the greatest mental impact on the Israelis. This was all laid out by them publicly. You just didn't know how serious they were, when it was going to happen, and you know, obviously the government took it as bluster. Brilliant. You know, we talked about the savagery. We talked about where they get their money from. Now let's talk about where we are here and what is going to likely happen. You know, and the timing of this. Let's talk about timing of this for a second. So, you know, one of you asked why now, and you know, we've been reading in the media about Saudi-Israeli normalization coming along, okay, and it's closer than not. I mentioned that Hamas gets most of its money from Iran, a lot of training, arms that aren't always interdicted successfully by the Egyptians or by the Israelis, um, and basically, who would benefit the most from the Saudi-Israeli normalization not going through? Iran. I mean, it's very simple. And, you know, likewise, Iran would have to make some pretty strong promises to Hamas about support if they did something like this. Now, by the way, why would this stop Saudi-Israeli normalization? Because Israel's reaction is going to get very bloody, and you know, whether it's on Al Jazeera TV, which is owned by Qatar, which plays both sides between the U.S. and Iran all the time, and it's really an anti-Semitic TV network that's beamed throughout the Arab world. You know, the sight of Israel killing civilians by necessity, and based on how Hamas fights wars, hiding behind their civilians, would impact the Arab street, would make it difficult politically for Saudi Arabia to proceed with normalization, at least on the timing that was expected. Now, you know, if you looked at the Saudis on this subject, the Saudis respect hard power more than anything. And, you know, we saw back in the earlier 2000s, I think it was 2006, I'm not sure, I forget. Israel was engaged in conflict in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which is, of course, the Iranian proxy, and you know, 10 times larger than Hamas. And Saudi Arabia politically gave Israel, and this is way before the Abraham Accords and all this other stuff, they gave Israel a lot of political cover for going and doing what had to be done against Hezbollah. Now, unfortunately, Israel wasn't really prepared to do it properly, and I'll get to that in a second. And it was really just, I don't want to call it a partial success. It was a stalemate. And the Saudis were very disappointed with that. Now, that kind of takes us to where this has to result. You know, you could say to yourself, and I say to myself, and 90% of Israelis say to themselves, or maybe 95% of Israelis say to themselves, Israel's got to eliminate Hamas, full stop. Not teach them a lesson, okay, not destroy a lot of their buildings, but eliminate them as a force in Gaza. Netanyahu, who has this reputation as a right-wing guy, but he's really been the most cautious guy militarily Israel's had in some time, because as I mentioned, he's been playing this balance game for a decade and very successfully, result-wise until now. he is the idea of going in and doing a ground invasion in Gaza is as far from what he wanted to see as possible. However, his place in history is now probably destroyed. His grasp on power is imperiled. Um, not for nothing, but President Biden also wanted this Saudi normalization because he wanted, a feather in his cap politically. And it's ironic because the Saudis and the Israelis were doing just fine until America got involved and started injecting the Palestinian issue into the conversations, which embarrassed the Saudis, which kind of slowed it down. But put that aside, Bibi and Biden need the Saudi thing to go through. For the Saudi normalization to go through, Israel's going to have to win convincingly in Gaza. That means it can't just blow up a lot of buildings. It can't, really, kill some, do some targeted assassinations. It really has to go into Gaza on the ground and uproot Hamas. That is something that no one in Israel, particularly the military of all, don't want it. But the citizenry accepts that this is a sacrifice that now has to be made. And it's going to cost us probably another 1,000 young soldiers. I mean, frankly, if you talk to people who, look at this, I don't know. Hopefully it's much less. And I don't know, maybe a miracle happens. I don't know. But there's one problem. The Israeli military over the years, and in an attempt to be violent and destroy Hamas, you have to go in. You really have to go in on the ground, and not just with elite units. You really have to go in, dominate, capture territory. Be a lot of dead civilians because of how dense it is, and the Hamas fighting style of hiding behind civilians. I've spoken to Israeli friends who tell me it's horrible to say, but the hostages, you just can't think about the hostages at this point. One problem is over the last 10 to 15 years, the Israeli strategy towards training its ground forces has focused on training elite forces who could go in deep and execute surgical missions and important missions. And while in the last year or so they've been trying to train up for broader ground invasion type things, even with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the approach has always been, let's just use air, let's just use drones, let's use intelligence, and let's use special forces. It's going to cost us too much in terms of blood to go in with mass armored units and infantry units, and it's a nightmare. And so let's set up our strategy to rely on on a lower risk asset set. To knock out Hamas, as deeply embedded as they are, most people feel you're going to have to go in all in. And Israel's not really been training for that. So that could be really horrible. And that's where the idea of significant losses come from. It's not pinpricks. This is more urban warfare, Russia, Ukraine style. Anyway, whatever. Well, just Ukraine, it's a different thing, but where they have had urban warfare. So because when you go in to clean up the envelope, to clean up Gaza, now what, right? So, let's say we're unanimously agreeing that Hamas has to be removed, although actually, you listen to some of the things Netanyahu is saying, he never uses the term, we're removing Hamas. He says, we're going to strike Hamas a blow, we're going to destroy everything they have, and that kind of scares some Israelis, and it scares me, because I understand he's trying to keep freedom of action, but it's not what we want to hear. And especially since no one really trusts him. And at this point, no one really trusts the military either, given the failure and given their hesitancy to deal with Hamas over the years and protecting us, it's a little scary. Um, but frankly, I think the only way he has a political future, or at least protects his reputation at all, is if he destroys Hamas, and because that will lead to the Saudi thing, and you know, it is what it is. Okay. Media and politics, which plays into this, is going to get, again, I'm chairman of Honest Reporting. That's going to get a lot worse. It's, what's the name of that book? The world loves a dead Jew. We have 600 just yesterday. And so the media is sympathetic, world governments are sympathetic. They're seeing horrible ISIS-like videos of savagery all over all over media. So, right now everything's good. But what's going to happen a week from now, when Israel is pounding the crap out of Gaza, starts going in on the ground, there'll be tons of civilian casualties. Hamas is excellent at broadcasting those as well. Media is their thing. The Western media, whether it's because they just like blood and conflict because it sells, or also because of their own, the mainstream media is, liberal or left-leaning, angles. You're going to start hearing, well, wow, yeah, the Israelis really took it on the chin, but they can't do this. This is horrible. I can't look at it. It's time for diplomacy. Okay? Israel can't buckle under to that this time for the reasons I stated. Because again, if they get stopped, Hamas will build a bigger, stronger. They'll know that after doing what they just did, there is no deterrence of them unless they are destroyed. So, Israel's going to have to be tough when the world starts yelling for it's time for diplomacy. And Biden is going to have to stand by his promises to stand by Israel no matter what, which I find hard to believe, but, whatever. And it's going to cost a lot of money to get this done, and more important, to occupy Gaza, because what happens once you knock out Hamas? Unless you've got a dictator like Saddam Hussein there to take control, Israel's going to have to be there for a while, and that's going to be costly in terms of money and blood. And even though there are a lot of Gazans who are going to be very happy to point to this guy and that guy and say, he was Hamas because he made my life miserable, I'm going to give him up, which is really how the Israeli intelligence service works so well in both Gaza and in, more importantly, West Bank, is you use one against the other. It's always worked that way, particularly, with Arab clans. It works extremely well that way, but still, it's going to be very costly. So, Israel's going to take it on the chin, public relations wise. People like us at Honest Reporting are going to be trying to make sure the story is put in context and there aren't inaccuracies, and people remember these ISIS-like savagery and all of that. So, that's that. On that point, I just ask if you can support Honest Reporting. Go to our website, honestreporting.com. It would be wonderful, because we lost a couple of people, went into the army, and were called up. We're running 24/7, and it's going to get worse, not better. And we're going to need more people, and we don't have money for more people. And then they're going to look to me and the board, and we'll just figure it out. So please, this is one that's worth it. We do a lot of trips with journalists where we expose, and like we just had one yesterday, where, we had a bunch of speakers educating journalists from Bloomberg and Reuters and the Times and, you name it. And that's what we do, because that's one of the things we do besides the media correction stuff, because it's important, it's necessary. Anyway, people have asked me the last couple of days, what media do I read to get my information on Israel? So my answer on that one is same thing for American news. Diversification is critical. Reading several sources is critical because everyone, I mean, not everyone, but most media organizations today shade things to their own narrative or to their own prejudices or just to their own access to information. And if you read several, you could kind of build the context in your own mind and get closer to what the truth is. So anyway, for the center, what I call the center, I look to the Jerusalem Post, Ynet News. Well, some people will argue with me about Ynet, and I-24, which is a TV service you can get online, or on some cable systems. So Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and I-24. On the right, I look to IsraelNationalNews.com. Israel National News. It's a bit raw, but it's very deep in coverage. They got, their Israeli news reflects more of what you read in the Israeli media than perhaps what you'd see in J-Post and some of the others I'll mention. And some of their angles and sources you may not agree with always. They are from the right, but they definitely give perspective and explanation that may make you think sometimes about an issue. And then if you want to see what's on the left or the center left, and then also jns.org is a great, higher quality Americanized right-wing leaning news source. On the left, or the middle to left, you have the Times of Israel, which is, I'll call them liberal/progressive, and then Haaretz, which is crazy, but there it is. Okay, I mean their Haaretz is left wing. Some of their columnists, particularly, are post-Zionist. They're really, I don't know why they live in Israel, but they're there. Okay. Again, you look at several sources for a reason. Now, one last thing people have asked me: how does the political judicial reform crisis play into all this? And I'm saying the reservists aren't going to show up because they're not going to work for this government. Blah 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 blah. You know what? When Israel finds itself at war, all the politics melts away temporarily. It will be back, but for now, it's gone away. Brothers of Arms, which is an anti-Netanyahu group of reservists, they were telling people, don't go into the reserves, don't show up for duty when you're called because blah blah blah. Yesterday, about a couple of hours into this, they immediately called and told everyone. They said, we strongly beg that people show up for service. And there have been no issues with people not showing up. In fact, from what I'm hearing, Israelis are busting down the doors to be called, at the reserve centers, to be called up ahead of them being called up. And that includes discharged, overaged reservists. The country unifies against outside threat, and this is what they're dealing with now. And they know that if Hezbollah gets into this could become an existential threat. Again, that's an area where that's where Israel's gonna need Biden to lean on Iran, and frankly, I'm not too confident about that. Whether you love him or hate him, and most of us don't really like him much. If Trump were president right now, I don't think this would have happened in the first place because Iran would be afraid of the repercussions for fostering it. B, I certainly don't think there'd be a risk of Hezbollah getting into it because at that point, I think that they know that the U.S. would do something to Iran. With this government, he tried to talk tough yesterday, but will he be believed? I don't know, and that's really the risk. But short answer is Israelis are united to sacrifice, and they're going to do what needs to be done, and hopefully the political leaders listen to the street this time. Anyway, that's what I've got for you. If you have any questions, you know how to reach out to me. Again, stay close to the news. Any way you could support Israel, social media, see anything in the press. I mean, social media, you should be commenting to anything that you think is wrong, okay, or deceptive or biased, both news pieces as well as social media pieces. Go to honestreporting.com to see our coverage of what's going on, as well as actually most of the news coverage that we do is really on social media. But and also if you could please help us however you can. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope this wasn't too long. Bye bye.